The forest had always been peaceful, until that summer morning. A veteran and his loyal German shepherd stumbled upon a rusted military case buried deep beneath the roots. The moment he opened it, a silent signal shot through the sky, and something out there heard it. Then came the drone, the strangers, the hunt. Who buried this secret in the heart of the forest? And why are dangerous men willing to risk everything to get it back? Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below and subscribe. The summer morning settled gently over the Appalachian woods. The air was warm but calm, carrying the scent of wet moss and cool creek water after the storm that had passed in the night. Sunlight filtered through the canopy in narrow bands, touching the forest floor like quiet hands. This hour of the day had always been Ethan Cole's favorite. The world still felt soft then, unhurried, as if everything dangerous had not yet remembered its way back. Ethan walked slowly along the narrow dirt trail, his boots crunching softly over damp earth. His shoulders were broad, but carried a slight curve forward, the shape of a man who had known both strength and weight. He was 47 years old. His hair was dark chestnut streaked with silver at the temples. His beard was short, covering a square jaw. The skin on his face was tanned and lined, shaped by years of sun and wind. His eyes were a gray-green, steady but distant, the eyes of someone who had learned to watch before he spoke. Beside him walked Scout, a large 6-year-old German shepherd with a thick coat of black and tan fur. His ears were upright, his steps sure, his amber eyes alert. Scout was not just a dog. He was the steady presence that had kept Ethan grounded when the echoes of war returned uninvited. Ethan had brought Scout home from a shelter years ago, and since then they had walked this trail nearly every morning. Ethan drew in a long breath. He liked the sound of this forest. It was not quiet exactly. It was alive in a way that reminded him of everything he had fought to protect. It was a sound that wrapped around him like an old blanket. Scout moved ahead, sniffing the edges of the path. His tail swayed in a slow rhythm, neither nervous nor excited, simply awake to the world. About a mile into the walk, Scout froze. His tail rose, ears twitching. Ethan stopped immediately. Over the years, he had learned to trust the dog's instincts more than his own. Scout barked sharply. It was not a frightened bark, but a signal. He turned his body toward the creek that ran parallel to the path and charged forward through the undergrowth. Ethan followed without hesitation, his boots slipping on the soft ground. The creek was narrow here, framed by thick ferns and the roots of trees that reached deep into the earth. Scout was standing at the edge of the bank, barking again, his head low and ears pressed forward. The ground had changed. Ethan saw it immediately. A patch of earth had collapsed near the roots of a large oak tree, exposing something beneath. The sinkhole was fresh, raw, the mud still dark and slick from last night's rain. Ethan crouched at the edge and peered inside. Beneath the tangle of roots, a hard corner of metal jutted out of the soil. It was dull, not rusted through, built from the kind of steel meant to last. He slid down the slope carefully, his hands sinking into the wet soil. Scout followed, his nose working the air. Ethan brushed away the loose dirt. Slowly, the shape of the object came into focus. It was a rectangular metal box, thick and reinforced. The faded military green of its surface told Ethan what his mind had already guessed. There were markings on the side, faint but still readable. A winged insignia of a unit he remembered from stories told in dusty outposts years ago. Under it, the words Unit 46, decommissioned. The letters were almost erased by time. Ethan stared at it, his heart tightening. That name carried weight. There had been whispers in the service about a convoy gone missing, about files sealed before anyone could ask why. Scout circled the hole, hackles raised just slightly. It was a quiet sign of unease. Ethan reached out and placed a hand on the box. The metal was cold and damp. It did not feel like a lost tool or a forgotten crate. It felt like something that had been buried for a reason. The forest sounds pressed close around them. Creek water trickled. Leaves rustled in the breeze. Yet beneath those sounds, Ethan felt the familiar edge of alertness, the same feeling that had warned him in darker places. He knew that weight. He had lived through it. He sat back on his heels and forced himself to breathe slowly. Scout whined softly and nudged his arm. Ethan rubbed the dog's head without taking his eyes off the box. In his chest, a quiet calculation had already begun. If this had been hidden here for years, someone had wanted it to stay hidden. And if the storm had uncovered it, then that silence had just been broken. He rose carefully, scanning the tree line out of habit. Nothing moved beyond the usual life of the woods. Birds still called. The wind still stirred the leaves. But Ethan's instincts whispered that things were not as quiet as they looked. He wiped the mud from his palms and crouched again, examining the latches. They were corroded, but not fused. With the right tools, he could open it later, alone. He considered leaving it and walking away, but the thought of someone else finding it pulled at him like a knot tightening in his chest. Scout barked once, a short, sharp sound that made Ethan glance toward the trees. The dog was staring upstream, ears swiveling. Nothing moved, but the feeling was there. Ethan stepped out of the sinkhole slowly. The morning light fell across the box like a spotlight on a stage. It sat half buried, patient and heavy, as if it had been waiting for this moment. Scout fell into step beside him, closer now than before. The forest still looked beautiful. Sunlight painted the undergrowth in gold. Dragonflies floated above the creek. But beneath that surface, something had shifted. This morning had begun like any other. Yet something hidden had surfaced. And Ethan knew the forest was no longer as silent as it had been. The summer heat sat softly over the Appalachian woods, warm, but not yet pressing. The sky was a smooth blue, and a gentle wind whispered through the pine trees, carrying the faint scent of wet earth. The forest still held the cool breath of the night storm, the air damp and heavy with the memory of rain. Morning sunlight reached through the canopy like careful fingers, lighting patches of ground in soft gold. Ethan Cole knelt at the edge of the sinkhole where the box had been found that morning. His hands were streaked with soil, the rough texture grounding him in the present. He was a man who had lived through years of war and long stretches of silence afterward. The kind of man whose shoulders carried invisible weight even on quiet days. At 47, Ethan's face bore the history of sun and wind. The skin was rough, but steady, his jaw lined with short dark stubble touched with silver. His hair, chestnut with streaks of gray, framed a face carved by discipline and solitude. The gray-green of his eyes seemed distant, as if always watching something far away. For him, stillness was not peace. It was a state between memory and vigilance. Beside him stood Scout, his 6-year-old German shepherd. The dog's black and tan coat was damp from brushing against the wet ferns. His body was lean and strong, his posture alert but controlled. Scout's amber eyes scanned the woods the way a soldier might, slow and deliberate. Ethan sometimes thought the dog understood more than most people did. Scout had the calm of a creature who listened to the world rather than rushed through it. Ethan brushed the dirt away from the latch of the box and opened it slowly. The hinges groaned, but did not resist. Inside, wrapped carefully in waterproof cloth, lay a single metal tube and a small rectangular device with a cracked plastic screen. The tube was military issue. Ethan recognized the build instantly. He had seen dozens like it overseas, usually in convoy transports or secure equipment caches. He lifted the tube, felt its weight, then set it aside and examined the device. It was light, worn, the button smooth from years of pressure. It should not have still been functional after so long. But when he pressed the power button, the screen blinked to life. A pale green light filled the small display, then pulsed like a heartbeat. Ethan felt a cold tightness form in his chest. The device was not just active, it was transmitting. Numbers scrolled across the screen, code sequences he did not recognize. He leaned closer, the habit of a man who had spent years reading what was not meant to be read. Scout gave a low growl, not loud, not fearful, but sharp. Ethan looked up and followed the dog's gaze. The woods were still, but Scout's body was rigid, ears forward, tail stiff. Ethan's hand drifted to the strap of his backpack, not because there was a weapon inside, but because the gesture made him feel anchored. Old instincts moved faster than thought. He scanned the tree line, searching for movement. There was nothing, just the wind pushing through branches. He looked back at the device. The green light flashed faster now, like it had found something to speak to. The sound was faint, but there, a steady pulse beneath the wind. Not static, a signal. He did not understand the code, but he recognized what it meant. Someone or something was listening. The thought slid into his chest like cold water. There were very few things buried in the forest by accident. And something still waiting on the other end meant that whatever this was had never truly been forgotten. His jaw tightened, the weight of quiet decisions pressing behind his ribs. Years of service had taught him not to panic when the ground shifted under his feet. It had also taught him that every small discovery came with a cost. He powered down the device, but the pulse seemed to echo in his ears long after the screen went dark. Scout did not relax. His head remained turned toward the deeper woods, as if watching something Ethan could not yet see. That night, the forest carried a different sound. Ethan sat on the porch of his small cabin at the edge of the woods, the old wooden planks creaking softly beneath the weight of his boots. His cabin was plain, built by his own hands years ago, when he had decided that distance was easier than trying to fit into a world that had moved on without him. It was a simple place, one room, a tin roof that sang when it rained, a porch where Scout liked to lie with his head resting on Ethan's boots. Scout was not resting tonight. He paced the porch, head tilted toward the tree line. The air was thick and still, the kind of stillness that carried sound too far. Ethan felt the weight of the box inside, sitting beneath his table. He had not opened the metal tube yet, not because he feared what was inside, but because he already knew it would not make things simpler. Nothing that came from a forgotten unit ever did. A faint mechanical hum reached him, subtle, but there. Scout froze. Ethan followed his gaze upward. Through the dark outline of the trees, A small light moved silently. It hovered just beyond the reach of the porch light. The shape was round, no larger than a dinner plate, the light a dim red that blinked at steady intervals. A drone. Ethan's heart did not race. He had trained himself out of that long ago. Instead, he watched, his breath slow, steady, controlled. The drone did not move like a hobbyist toy. It did not bob or weave. It held position, deliberate and quiet. Someone was controlling it. Someone who already knew where to look. Scout growled, low and deep. Ethan whispered a wordless sound, just enough to steady the dog. Scout did not sit, but he did not bark either. His body stayed coiled like a spring. The drone lingered another few seconds, then drifted upward and away into the tree line, disappearing as silently as it had arrived. Ethan stayed where he was. Years ago, he might have reacted differently. He might have gone after it, or called someone, or prepared for what was coming next. But experience had taught him the danger of moving too quickly when you did not yet understand the shape of what hunted you. He sat back in his chair, watching the place where the light had vanished, feeling the quiet of the forest stretch long and thin. It had begun in the morning with a box in the ground, a single heartbeat of green light. And now the night sky carried the hum of something that did not belong. Scout finally settled at his feet, but his ears stayed up, listening. Ethan reached down, resting his hand on the dog's back. The warmth of the animal against his palm grounded him. A drone at the edge of his land meant someone else knew about the signal. Someone had been waiting or searching. And now they were closer than he liked. He leaned back slowly, the wooden chair groaning beneath his weight. A familiar stillness spread through him. It was not calm, not comfort. It was the quiet just before the storm. He'd lived there many times before. The forest around him seemed the same, trees still swaying gently in the summer night. But Ethan knew what Scout knew. Something had changed. The morning rose clear and hot over the Appalachian Ridge, the sunlight breaking through the tall green canopy in bright shards. The air smelled of pine resin and wet soil. Cicadas were already beginning their endless song. The forest, heavy with summer, felt alive in every direction. Ethan Cole stepped outside his cabin with a cup of coffee in his hand. His brown hair, streaked with gray, clung slightly to his forehead with sweat. The line of his jaw was tight as always, a quiet tension that had become second nature since the war. Scout trotted beside him, tail swaying, paws soft on the dirt. Ethan's eyes were sharp, scanning the familiar ground as if expecting something out of place. Years of habit had trained him to notice details others might ignore. That morning, he noticed them. The first was the shape of tire tracks pressed into the soft earth behind the cabin. The pattern was wide and deep, heavier than a dirt bike, too small for a truck. It was an ATV. The second detail was the set of boot prints leading away from the cabin toward the forest's edge. The spacing between the prints was even and deliberate, not the careless stride of a hiker. Ethan crouched beside the tracks, the shadow of his figure stretching long over the grass. He pressed his fingers lightly against the tread. The soil was still damp, which meant the intruder had passed less than a few hours ago. Scout moved closer, nose to the ground, sniffing along the prints. His fur bristled slightly as a low growl rumbled in his chest. Ethan whispered a calm tone and placed a steady hand on the dog's back. But Scout's body remained tense, his amber eyes fixed on the tree line. Ethan exhaled slowly. The quiet days were over. After last night's drone, this was confirmation. Someone had found them. Inside the cabin, Ethan spread the map he had taken from the metal tube. The coordinates were printed in faded ink, a series of numbers that led deep into the heart of the forest, an area he had never explored. He had spent enough time in reconnaissance units to understand one truth. If you waited for trouble to come to you, you had already lost. He folded the map with care, tucked it into his jacket, and loaded his pack with essentials: water, dried food, a compass, and a hunting knife that had belonged to his father. His movements were slow and deliberate, the kind of discipline that stayed with soldiers long after they had left the service. When he was done, he looked at Scout. The dog stood by the door, ready. Ethan gave a single nod. "Let's move," he murmured. Scout's tail flicked once in answer. They set off just as the sun cleared the ridge. The forest swallowed them whole within minutes, the sounds of the world narrowing to wind, insects, and the rhythmic crunch of boots and paws on the path. Ethan kept his pace steady, the map folded in his left hand. The coordinates pointed north-northwest. Scout led the way, occasionally pausing to sniff the air or listen. Every few hours, Ethan marked their route in his notebook. Habit born of long campaigns where getting lost was worse than being caught. The deeper they moved into the forest, the thicker the air became. The trees grew taller, their branches interlocking to create a tunnel of green light. Birds called in the distance. Somewhere to the west, water murmured through the roots of a hidden stream. Scout's nose twitched constantly, catching faint scents that Ethan could not sense. The dog would pause, ears high, then continue with a low whine of warning. As the afternoon deepened, Ethan began to notice subtle changes. The forest was quieter now, the calls of birds fading. The air carried the faint smell of fuel, sharp and out of place. He crouched, brushing his fingers along a patch of dirt. Tire tracks again, faint but there. Whoever had been near his cabin was ahead of them, moving along the same path. The realization hit him like cold iron. Someone else had the coordinates. He looked at Scout. The dog's ears flattened, and his tail dropped low. Ethan whispered, "We stay off the path." They veered into the underbrush, moving parallel to the tracks. Ethan moved with a hunter's care, each footstep chosen, every sound measured. Sweat slid down his neck, and the strap of his pack cut into his shoulder. The summer air pressed against him, thick and unrelenting. Yet he pushed forward, driven by something between duty and dread. Dusk came slow, and amber through the trees. The sky faded from gold to violet. Ethan found a small clearing by a ridge and decided to rest. He set his pack down, letting his knees sink into the soft grass. Scout drank from a small canteen and then sat facing the forest, his gaze unwavering. Ethan stared at the map again. The coordinates led just a few miles farther, near a marked elevation drop, an old mining zone abandoned decades ago. He thought of the metal box, the active device, the drone hovering over his cabin. All of it led here. He felt a flicker of something between fear and curiosity, though fear had long stopped controlling him. When night came fully, the forest turned black. Fireflies drifted like small sparks over the grass. Ethan leaned back against a fallen log, his rifle close by. Scout lay near his feet, but the dog's rest was not deep. His ears flicked constantly, his breathing shallow. Around midnight, Scout rose suddenly. His head turned toward the north. Ethan sat up, heart steady, listening. The sound came faintly at first, like wind scraping metal. Then it was clearer. A hum, mechanical, distant, but real. He stood and peered through the dark. On the far side of the ridge, a pale light flickered between the trees. It was not firelight. It was electric, steady. Ethan packed his gear quickly. Scout was already alert, ready to move. They moved quietly down the ridge, slipping between ferns and roots until the light grew closer. Through the leaves, the shape began to take form. A small structure sat in the clearing, metal walls streaked with rust, its roof half caved in. The structure was no cabin. It was a communications outpost. Ethan approached carefully, every sense alive. The building was old, but not forgotten. The ground around it was disturbed, footprints leading to the door. He motioned for Scout to stay low and push the door open. The hinges creaked softly. Inside, the air smelled of dust and iron. The walls were lined with shelves, wires, and panels. A single light blinked faintly on a device hanging from the ceiling, a sealed military radio unit. Its casing bore the same insignia as the box from the creek. Ethan's chest tightened. The radio had been sealed, tagged with an identification code and a red wax stamp that read, "Property of Unit 46. He stepped closer, brushing the dust from the metal surface. The device was still warm. Someone had been here. He scanned the floor. A half-burned cigarette rested on the ground near the wall. The ash was fresh. Scout growled, the low vibration echoing through the small space. Ethan turned, his instincts pulling tight. In the darkness beyond the door, something shifted. The soft crunch of leaves, then silence. He raised his head slowly, listening. Nothing. Just the wind. But he knew better. They were not alone. His mind moved quickly, measuring the distance between them and the ridge, the time before dawn, the risk of staying. He looked at Scout, who was standing perfectly still, eyes fixed on the shadows outside. Ethan whispered, "We move before morning." The dog gave a quiet sound in answer. They slipped out into the night again, leaving the metal hut behind. The forest closed around them, the moon glinting faintly through the trees. Somewhere out there, someone else was hunting for the same truth. And now, Ethan knew. The game had already begun. The forest was still and damp in the hours before dawn. The summer night had not yet given way to the sun, and a pale silver fog clung to the ground like a second skin. The trees stood dark and silent, their crowns swaying gently in the faint wind that whispered down from the ridge. It was the hour when even birds did not sing, when silence felt heavier than sound. Ethan Cole crouched at the edge of the ridge overlooking the old metal shack. His breath came slow and steady, the practiced rhythm of someone who had spent a lifetime moving in the shadows. Beside him, Scout pressed close to the earth, his fur damp with dew. The dog's amber eyes glinted faintly in the half-darkness, locked on the clearing below. Ethan's hands were steady, but inside his chest, a slow weight began to build. He knew this hour. The world before dawn was when soldiers moved, when enemies made their quietest advances. It had been years since he last felt that kind of quiet crawl under his skin. The old radio unit inside the shack had gone silent after his inspection hours earlier. But the forest had not returned to stillness. It had shifted instead, the way it did before something entered it that did not belong. Scout's ears twitched. A low growl rose from his chest, almost too soft to hear. Ethan placed a hand on the dog's shoulder. He felt the muscles tense beneath the thick coat. Through the fog, faint shadows emerged along the tree line near the shack. At first, They moved like hunters, slow and methodical, checking their corners, scanning the ground. Ethan counted 4 of them. Their figures were lean, dressed in dark clothing that broke up their shape against the trees. Each carried a compact rifle slung close to the chest. No reflective patches, no official markings. These were not rangers, not locals. Their movements were too coordinated for that. They fanned out around the clearing, one sweeping toward the back of the shack, another covering the path. Ethan's heartbeat did not quicken, but his focus narrowed. Every sense clicked into place like an old machine starting up. He whispered softly to Scout, and the dog lowered his body even closer to the ground. Ethan had learned to trust the dog's instincts. If Scout was this tense, they were dangerously close. One of the armed men stepped into the shack. A dull flash of red came through the open door as he activated the power switch on the old transmitter. A faint hum filled the clearing. The radio unit came to life, its small light blinking steadily. The rest of the team formed a perimeter. Their leader stood a little apart from the others. He was tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent years giving orders in dangerous places. His face caught a sliver of moonlight as he pulled back his hood. He looked to be in his early 50s, a hard man carved from old battlefields. His skin was rough and tanned, the kind that belonged to someone who had spent his life outside. A close-cropped beard framed his square jaw, streaked with gray like iron filings. A long scar crossed from his right temple down to his cheek, deep and pale against the tan skin. His eyes were dark, steady, the kind of eyes that measured threats instead of reacting to them. This was a soldier, or someone who had once been one. Ethan knew the type well. He had seen men like this on both sides of the line. The leader gave a silent hand signal, and another man inside the shack opened a black case. A small satellite uplink unfolded like the bones of a mechanical bird. A moment later, a blue light blinked on the device. They were not just searching, they were transmitting. Ethan watched the team's silent efficiency and felt an old unease settle into his stomach. Whoever they were, they had come for the same thing he had stumbled onto. But unlike him, they had come prepared. He could hear faint beeps drifting through the still air, each one a reminder that the forest was no longer empty. Scout shifted slightly, a tiny movement, the kind a human might not hear. But the forest did not forgive such sounds. His paw brushed against a fallen branch. It cracked softly beneath the weight. It was not loud, but it was enough. One of the men outside the shack froze. His flashlight snapped up like a blade. The beam cut through the fog, sweeping across the ridge. It moved with calm precision, not panic. These were men trained to find things in the dark. Ethan's pulse remained steady, but his mind moved quickly. Distance 20 meters. Wind moving toward the clearing. No cover behind. He lowered himself flat against the wet ground and placed a firm hand on Scout's back. The dog went perfectly still, his breathing slow and silent. The flashlight beam inched closer, passing across ferns and rocks, searching for edges that did not belong. Another man joined the first, whispering something low. Their movements were smooth, controlled, not the scattered gestures of amateurs. Ethan forced his breathing to slow even more. Years ago, in a valley on the other side of the world, he had learned how to become part of the ground. Now, that lesson returned like a reflex. Scout's heartbeat thumped against his palm. Fast, but contained. The flashlight stopped just short of their hiding place. The leader called out a short phrase, words Ethan could not hear but recognized by rhythm alone. A command. The men lowered their beams slightly, but did not relax. They were not leaving. They were waiting. Ethan felt the weight of the night pressing down. This was no accident. These men had followed the signal just as he had, and they had beaten him here. The first light of dawn was still far off, but the forest was already holding its breath. Ethan's thoughts narrowed to one clear fact. This was not about stumbling onto an old box anymore. Someone else had been moving toward this for a very long time. The late afternoon sun filtered through the summer canopy, soft and golden, warming the air as cicadas filled the forest with their restless song. The river beside the trail moved steadily, carrying the scent of cool stone and moss. A thin mist hung over the gorge ahead, where the sound of rushing water grew louder with each step. Ethan Cole moved slowly through the brush, his breath steady, his heartbeat measured. Scout moved beside him, low to the ground, his tan and black fur damp from the spray of the river. They had been following the signal for hours, winding deeper into the heart of the forest, where no trails were marked. Ethan's boots pressed quietly into the damp soil, leaving no more sound than the wind in the leaves. His eyes were sharp, alert to every shadow, every broken twig. Years of soldiering had trained him to move like this, to melt into the terrain, to breathe with it. And though the years had worn down the edge of youth, they had carved patience and precision in its place. The waterfall came into view like a moving wall of white, crashing into a deep pool below. The rocks around it were slick and dark with moss, and behind the curtain of water, a shadow hinted at something man-made. Scout stopped and lowered his head, ears forward. Ethan crouched beside the dog and traced the air with his eyes. The signal was strongest here. The hidden facility was real. Ethan's mind began working through the old mechanics of battlefield tactics. He knew the group behind them would not be far. Men like those didn't lose trails easily. He ran his hand through the damp fur behind Scout's ears. The dog tilted his head and waited. Ethan's voice was low, almost a breath. It was time to set a trap. They moved to the west side of the waterfall, climbing over slick stones and ducking under hanging ferns. Ethan found a position along the ridge where he had a clear angle on the base of the falls but remained hidden behind boulders and brush. He unpacked his small rifle, checked the chamber, and steadied his breathing. Scout slipped down to the lower ground, moving like a shadow. His role was to draw attention, a tactic they had used before. Ethan trusted the dog with his life, not because Scout was trained to perfection, but because the bond between them had been forged in long, quiet years, where trust was the only constant. Minutes passed like stretched wire. The roar of the waterfall covered all other sound, making silence sharper. Then Ethan saw movement along the tree line below. 3 of the men from before emerged first, moving with that same smooth precision. They wore dark tactical clothing, rifles close to their chests, helmets low over their brows. Their leader followed seconds later, the scar on his cheek catching a glint of light, his eyes hard and scanning. Ethan stayed perfectly still, steadying his rifle. His thoughts were not frantic, but clear. He had spent too many nights in ambush positions overseas not to know this feeling. His body remembered what his mind tried not to. The cold crawl in his chest, the taste of metal in the air, the strange quiet between breath and action. Scout made the first move, a rustle in the ferns to the west, a single sharp bark. The group reacted instantly. Two men swung toward the sound, rifles raised, the third man covering their flank. Their leader lifted his hand and gave a short signal. Ethan used the moment to shift position, sliding like a shadow along the ridge. When the first shot cracked through the forest, it was controlled and precise. One of the armed men stumbled as the bullet tore through his shoulder. Chaos rippled through their line. Scout moved like a streak of muscle and fur, drawing fire to the west. Ethan fired again. Another man fell to his knees, weapon clattering against the rocks. The leader moved faster than the rest, dropping low and scanning for the angle of attack. His eyes were sharp, experienced. He barked an order and returned fire toward the ridge. Ethan pressed against the rock as bullets ripped bark and stone above his head. He felt no panic, only the narrowing of focus that came with years of combat. His fingers were steady on the trigger, his breathing measured. Scout burst from the shadows again, teeth bared, drawing attention from the last man on the ground. Ethan moved out of cover, his steps quiet even in the chaos. He fired one more shot, dropping the last soldier before the man could adjust his aim. The leader turned toward the sound, rifle raised, eyes locked on the ridge. For a long second, the world narrowed to just the two of them. The waterfall thundered behind. The forest held its breath. Ethan shifted his aim, but the leader did not fire immediately. He crouched slightly, testing the ground, moving with the instinct of someone who had lived this life for decades. He fired a short burst, forcing Ethan back behind cover. Scout lunged from the side, a flash of tan and black, teeth sinking into the man's arm. The leader shouted in pain, staggering but refusing to fall. He swung the rifle like a club. Ethan moved in from behind, slamming his shoulder into the man's back. They both hit the ground, hard on wet stones, the rifle skidding out of reach. The struggle was fast and brutal. The man fought like someone who had survived too many battles to give up easily. His scarred face twisted with anger and focus. Ethan felt his own muscles burn as they wrestled in the spray of the falls. Finally, he landed a hard strike that knocked the man against the rock wall. Scout stood growling over him, teeth inches from the man's throat. Ethan stayed still for a heartbeat, breathing hard, water dripping down his face. Behind the waterfall, a narrow, dark tunnel yawned like the mouth of something buried and waiting. Inside, dim lights flickered on old military equipment. Ethan knew that what lay inside would change everything, but for now, the path was clear. The late summer sun dipped low behind the treetops, casting long golden beams through the pines. The air was warm and still, carrying the faint scent of river water and sap. The forest that had once held danger now seemed quiet again. Ethan Cole sat on the wooden steps of his porch, his elbows resting on his knees, his weathered hands folded loosely together. His face, lined from years of service and a life lived half in shadow, was calm in a way it had not been for many years. Scout lay stretched out at his feet, his black and tan fur glowing softly in the afternoon light, his head resting across Ethan's boot. The dog's breathing was steady, content. The sound of distant cicadas filled the air, like the soft hum of something that had been there long before and would remain long after. It had been only a few days since the federal task force swept through the hidden military site behind the waterfall. The morning after the gunfight, the signal burst intercepted from the shack had led them straight in. Ethan had not asked for credit, but his name and the dog's name were already in every official report. The men who had hunted in the shadows were gone. The network that had buried secrets under the forest had been pulled into the light. He leaned back slightly, the old porch wood creaking beneath him. The ache in his shoulder, a souvenir from years past, flared when the air cooled, but it was a familiar pain. It was the kind that reminded him he had made it through. He glanced down at Scout. The dog's ears twitched at the sound of something small moving in the brush, but relaxed when it found nothing threatening. Even in peace, Scout's instincts never slept. Ethan's thoughts moved backward to the night by the waterfall, to the face of the man with the scar, cold and calm, even when his plans crumbled, to the sound of the signal burst from the transmitter, to the silence when the last gunshot echoed away. He had seen men like that leader in faraway places, men who believed they were untouchable. But time had a way of reaching even the most careful predators. A car door shut somewhere up the gravel road. Scout's ears perked and his head lifted from Ethan's boot. A figure emerged from the shadows between the trees. Agent Harris walked with the slow but deliberate stride of a man used to moving through dangerous places. He was in his late 30s, lean but strong, his close-cropped dark hair showing flecks of early gray. A thin beard framed his jaw, neatly kept. He wore a plain field jacket rather than a suit, and his hands rested easily at his sides. There was a calm sharpness in his brown eyes, the look of someone who had seen enough to know what mattered and what didn't. Ethan had met him 2 days earlier when the federal agents arrived. Harris was the kind who asked questions without trying to prove a point. He had the posture of someone trained, but not loud about it. Ethan respected that. Harris stopped at the edge of the porch and gave Scout a small nod. The dog watched him carefully, tail giving one slow, cautious wag. Harris spoke evenly. "Quiet evening," he said, his voice low and rough from too many nights spent in briefing tents and dusty roads. Ethan nodded once. The forest finally remembered how to breathe again. Harris stepped up onto the porch and leaned against the rail. "We wrapped it up today. Everything down there is sealed off. The site will be turned into a historical military zone by the end of the year. No more signals. No more men with guns in your trees." Ethan gave a quiet exhale through his nose. That was as close as he came to a laugh. "Good," he said. "This place has seen enough." Harris studied him for a moment. "You know," he said slowly, "what you did out there doesn't happen often. Most people run when they stumble into something like this." Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, though his voice stayed level. "I stopped running a long time ago." Harris nodded, as if he understood more than Ethan had said. "The Bureau is recommending you for a civilian honor, and Scout too. The governor's office is already talking about it. People like a good ending." Ethan looked down at the dog. Scout was now lying on his side, his tail thumping lazily against the porch boards. "He did more than I did," Ethan said. "I just followed where the noise led." Harris smiled faintly. "Doesn't change the fact that without you, this whole network would still be buried under the dirt. You gave us the break we'd been waiting years for." Ethan didn't answer. Compliments were never something he'd carried well. His mind was already elsewhere, tracing the long path from that quiet morning at the creek to the firefight at the waterfall. A chain of choices. A signal that should have stayed silent. A war he hadn't chosen, but stepped into anyway. Harris pushed himself off the railing. The medal ceremony will be small. You don't have to show up if you don't want to. But I think they want people to see you, to see Scout. Remind them that not every story in these woods ends in silence. Ethan let the words settle. He wasn't a man who chased medals. But he thought of the look on Scout's face when the drone had appeared that first night. The dog hadn't hesitated for a second in any moment after that. Loyalty wasn't something you put into a ceremony, but sometimes it deserved to be witnessed. Harris walked back toward the road, the crunch of gravel under his boots fading. Scout lifted his head again, ears flicking toward the sound, then relaxed when the car started and rolled away. The forest slowly reclaimed its quiet. The sun had dropped lower now. Long beams of orange light cut through the trunks, scattering gold across the porch. Ethan stretched his legs out, and Scout shifted closer, resting his chin on Ethan's knee. For a moment, it was the same simple life he'd built for himself years ago. Except now, the silence didn't feel like a wall around him. It felt like a clearing. Ethan leaned his head back against the porch post, eyes half closed. The world out there was bigger than his cabin, bigger than the trees. Men with power had hidden things in the shadows for years. But this one time, the light had found its way in. And strangely enough, it had been a man and a dog who had carried it there. Scout made a small, contented sound in his throat. Ethan's hand rested gently on the dog's back. The forest exhaled with them. Evening light stretched across the clearing, and summer wrapped itself around the house like a warm, familiar coat. When the last light of summer touched the forest, Ethan and Scout's story became more than a hidden signal and a forgotten war. It became a reminder that courage often begins quietly, in an ordinary heart that chooses to act when no one else will. A man and his dog uncovered a darkness buried for years, but what truly mattered was not the danger they faced. It was how loyalty, faith, and quiet bravery lit a path through that darkness. In this world, miracles do not always arrive in thunder or fire. Sometimes they come through steady hands, a loyal companion, and a moment of grace. The Lord places strength in ordinary people to do extraordinary things. If one man and one dog can bring light to a hidden shadow, then each of us carries that same spark. May God bless every listener who has walked with this story. May He cover your home with peace, fill your heart with strength, and remind you that faith can move mountains. If this story touched your spirit, share it with someone who needs a little light. Leave a comment and subscribe for more stories of hope. Together, let us keep praying for His grace to guide us through every storm and into the warmth of His blessings.